Thank you. So, Joseph Humphrey Sloss was a famous and at times infamous public figure during his lifetime. He worked as a lawyer, a representative in the Illinois State Senate, a major in Alabama's Confederate cavalry during the American Civil War, a mayor of Tuscumbia, Alabama, a real estate and loan broker, an insurance salesman, U.S. Congressman for Alabama's 6th District, a U.S. Marshal, a U.S. Commissioner, a co-proprietor of a printing office, and a newspaper editor for at least one Illinois paper and also for several Alabama papers. He got around. Newsprint would provide a public stage for a number of Sloss's ill-conceived public arguments and shootings, controversies that kept him in the headlines as much or more than his political aspirations and other things that he did during his lifetime. So let's get started. So Joseph Humphrey Sloss was born on October 12, 1826 in Somerville, Alabama. His parents were Reverend James L. and Letitia Campbell Sloss. After finishing his general studies under his father, Joseph Sloss went on to study law and was admitted to the bar at the age of 18. He began his legal career by practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri for approximately 4 years, followed by his move to Edwardsville, Illinois in 1849, where he continued his practice. While living in Edwardsville, he married his wife, Mary L. Lusk, and the couple would have 5 children, 4 of which you see here who lived to adulthood or near adulthood. And also, just in case anyone is curious, his first cousin was James Withers Sloss of Sloss Furnace. So that's the connection there. Sloss was captain of the Illinois militia company named the Madison Guards, which was organized around 1857. Sloss was no longer on the roster by April 25, 1861. He served in the Illinois State Legislature from 1858 to 1859 as a member of the Know Nothing Party, which was pretty accurate. Sloss left for North Alabama in the opening days of the Civil War. Some of Illinois' papers noted Sloss's exit from the state in October of 1861. They were headlined, "Traitor Escaped." It is reported that Captain Joe Sloss, heretofore one of the leaders of the Democratic Party in Madison County and 2 years ago member of the legislature, has decamped, body, boots, treason and all, and has gone to Dixie to afford aid and comfort to the rebels. Well, let him go. We would rather have him there than here. Upon his return to Alabama, Sloss raised a company that became part of Philip D. Roddy's 4th Alabama Cavalry. Sloss's Civil War service, as reflected only in the service records that I found on Fold 3, is rather unremarkable. He began his service with the elected rank of captain and ended with the rank of major. He served in Company F, having enlisted in Florence, Alabama on September 15, 1862 for 3 years or war. This second record shows that Sloss had been assigned to special duty, which referred to his post doing recruiting work in Tuscumbia. Philip D. Roddy was Sloss's commanding officer, and it is clear that Roddy was impressed with Sloss. This letter from Sloss's service records file was marked with "Asks for appointment of Captain Joseph H. Sloss as member of military court of North Alabama." Roddy wrote, "If a military court shall be assigned to my command, I would respectfully suggest that Captain Joseph H. Sloss, Company F, 4th Alabama Cavalry Regiment, Roddy's Brigade, be appointed a member thereof. He is about 40 years old, a lawyer of considerable experience, has been in my command since September 1862, is captain of said company. I believe him fully qualified for that position, and as such that he would be more valuable to the service than in the line." In November of 1864, Sloss was serving as General Roddy's temporary judge advocate. This first record shows that Sloss had been in the Confederate service since September 14, 1862. The second record is where things get interesting. This letter is a separate collection from his service records on Fold 3 called the Union Citizens Files. In brief, it says, "Send Joseph Sloss, a prisoner now in confinement at Paducah, Kentucky, to this office as soon as possible by command of General Thomas." This is interesting because none of his service records say anything about him being captured. They don't say anything about him being in Paducah, Kentucky, or any of this story. The final record here shows that Sloss took the oath of allegiance on May 19th after supposedly surrendering on May 1st. This record notes his place of residence as being Franklin County, Alabama, and describes him as having a dark complexion with black hair and hazel eyes, and that he stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. If there are any records of a soldier deserting, he will not be granted a pension. So I looked at Alabama pension records and found this single letter that you see here. It was addressed to the Commissioner of Pensions from Mary Sloss's nephew, James Warren. The letter is dated prior to Sloss's death, and it shows James asking how someone would apply for a pension when they served in Alabama but now lived in Tennessee. By the point of this letter, Sloss and his wife were living in Memphis, so there was some confusion about where they needed to apply if they wanted to receive a pension. I next checked with the Tennessee State Library and Archives and found that Sloss's, by this time widow, Mary, had written to James Warren a second time asking for help with a pension application. In part, the letter reads, "Dear Jim, I am sorry to have to trouble you again when I know you're a busy man, but memory and witnesses fail to be able to clearly answer all questions. I have answered all I can with exactness. In 1863, her husband had been promoted to major and afterwards detailed to do recruiting work, which we saw on that other record. In 1865, he was taken prisoner at Florence and carried to Paducah, Kentucky. After a time was paroled. 6 weeks after, he was carried to General Meredith's headquarters and released, and in Nashville, he had signed the oath of allegiance." So this confirms that Sloss was captured before the 4th Alabama Cavalry surrendered most of them surrendered in Selma. So after receiving the previous letter from Mary Sloss, James Warren wrote to the Commissioner of Confederate Pensions in Nashville. With this letter, he informed the commissioner that he agreed with the statements made by Mary Sloss regarding her husband's military service and enclosed the pension application Mary had filled out. The application included confirmation that Sloss was a member of the 4th Alabama Cavalry and stated that he was not with his command when it was surrendered. Mary stated that he was a prisoner and presumably was around Nashville at the time of the surrender. Her application stated he was captured in Florence in 1865. This page of the application includes their marriage date and place. One of the questions asked is, how long did your husband serve in his company? And Mary answered, until 6 weeks before close of war. So that gives us a time frame of when he was captured. Another question asked, if not with his command at surrender, state clearly and specifically where he was when he left command, for what cause and by what authority, and Mary answered, in 1863, he was made major and was detailed for recruiting. So this is great because there are no records in his service records to say when he was promoted, and it also explains what that special service was on that first record. So how was Sloss captured? From what I could piece together from available newspapers, the answer was this guy. Moses M. Bain was an officer in the 50th Illinois Infantry and was in Tuscumbia in 1865. He had been a member of the Illinois state legislature at the same time Sloss was in office, and the pair had been friends. Bain allegedly contacted Sloss and invited him to meet for a chat. He says, hey, I'm going to be in the Tuscumbia area. Would you like to meet with me? We can talk and catch up on old times. So does anybody see a problem with that idea? About why it might not be a great idea to go meet an officer in the opposing army. So he goes, he takes the invitation up, and he goes and meets with Bain. And instead of finding a neutral spot away from the gunboat that Bain was on, he boarded the gunboat. The pair visited. And then when Sloss gets ready to leave, the captain of the gunboat is like, no, you're not. You're not going anywhere. You are a prisoner. And Bain, in the story, argued and said, no, I gave him promise of his safe passage if he came to visit. This was just a friendly meeting. And the captain wasn't having it, so Sloss was shipped to Paducah, Kentucky as a prisoner. So this incident would come back to haunt Sloss almost 10 years later. January of 1874, the Florence Times-Journal accused Sloss of seizing property of supposedly disloyal citizens during the war. This is the same Major Joseph H. Sloss, they wrote, who later in the war deserted the Confederacy and went north on a Federal gunboat. In May of 1876, lawyer and politician Joshua Burns Moore made a public speech at a political meeting. In this speech, he made reference to independents, so-called, trying to divide the Democratic Party, but he doesn't actually speak of Sloss by name. Sloss was at that time running as an independent candidate for Congress. So I'll say more about that later, but of course Sloss took offense to this and it turns into a war of words. This war of words would continue in the papers for several weeks. The Moulton Advertiser wrote of the public argument between Sloss and Moore that Sloss had been guilty of so many mean things that it would fill a book to enumerate them, and disgraceful enough to make an honest man hide his face forever from the Anglo-Saxon race. Sloss, in the process of all of these arguments, he got Bain to write a letter saying that, as an affidavit saying that, no, I didn't desert. No, he didn't desert. And it goes on back and forth until we have this argument right here. As to the charge that I deserted, I proved him a liar. As to his reference to salary grabber, I prove him to be a fool, and his conduct in the whole matter proves him the miserable coward. Moore responded that he had not been impressed by the affidavit that Bain had written, nor anything that Sloss had to say, and he said the epithets dog, falsifier, salary grabber, and deserter were applied to him, Sloss, in a manner to leave no room for a war of words. He ended his tirade against Sloss with, I shall reply only in a language of an import similar to that used and applied by me to his first article, but denouncing him as an infamous liar, falsifier, and slanderer, I dismiss the dirty dog without further comment nor notice. Sloss finally challenged Moore to a duel, and the pair agreed to meet in Memphis. So by this point, duels were illegal in the state of Alabama, so that's why they went over state lines. The next relevant headline in the paper was attempt to assassinate an editor. This notice came from a suspiciously anonymous source known only as a special telegram. The inaccurate report stated that Moore had attempted to assassinate Sloss and that William Cooper had stopped him. The article ended, Sloss has been on the street ever since the fuss, ready to meet his adversary in any manner. The truth of the situation was that parties interceded on behalf of Moore and Sloss to arbitrate the situation, and no guns were ever fired. Lawyer William Cooper and E.A. O'Neill, future governor of Alabama, and Colonel Charles McKiernan and Colonel John A. Steele amicably adjusted the argument into its conclusion. So no shots were ever fired, no blood was shed. And it is my thought that this anonymous telegram that we saw on the last slide was probably Sloss's last-ditch effort to try to dishonor Moore and show that, he started this. He, instead of actually having a duel, he tried to ambush me. So Cooper was one of the intervening parties once Sloss challenged Moore to a duel. This is the only account of the situation that I could find from one of the intervening parties, and this is from Cooper's journal. He wrote brief entries without much detail, but on May 30th, 1876, he wrote about the Sloss-Moore argument from the papers and compared the two to fighting roosters squaring off at each other with their feathers ruffled. And I love that he even used different colored pens to make it even more colorful. In following entries, Cooper wrote of Sloss and Moore's imbroglio political and compared the back and forth arguments between the two men to owls hooting at each other. Sloss's political career was colorful. It started out with both neutral and Democratic papers being happy that Sloss had been nominated and subsequently elected to office. And it's really disgustingly effusive. The Montgomery Advertiser wrote in 1870 that the recent nomination of this true and able Democrat for Congress in the 6th Congressional District is only the preliminary step to his election. It is unnecessary to say that Colonel Sloss's nomination is, in the highest sense, personally gratifying to us. And if that wasn't enough, the North Alabamian published an even more effusive article that was republished in the Moulton Advertiser. Major Joseph H. Sloss. We write the name of Major Sloss with a more than ordinary interest. Our interest is 1,000 times enhanced in the present utterance because of the heartfelt pride we feel in speaking of him as the nominee of the great Democratic Conservative Party for a seat in the Congress of the United States. The nomination, they wrote, had been proclaimed for a favorite son of Colbert. And they continued, the name Joseph H. Sloss belongs to the Democratic household. It has been the synonym of unswerving fidelity to the sacred cause of country and Southern homes and family altars. That synonym has now been extended and enlarged, and the people of the 6th Congressional District will most cheerfully pronounce him most worthy of all the honors the unconquerable Democratic conservative host of the district can confer upon our gallant standard bearer. Let Sloss be the rallying cry and victory the watchword, and as sure as these names are uttered by the Democratic conservative masses of the district, so certain will November next pronounce a triumph of which every honest man will feel a just and heartfelt pride. I mean, really. I mean, I don't know what they wanted from him, but it's pretty clear that they had plans. Once elected, Sloss made it into the headlines for a number of actions that Alabama citizens and newspapers disagreed with. A sample of these, because I don't have all day, it was the salary grab. Representatives were given $5,000 in pay per year. Sloss voted for a bill that would double the salary, both retroactively for the past term and for future terms. Public outrage led several men to decline their back pay, but Sloss was not one of them. The North Alabamian quoted Sloss as saying he had actually lost money from the bill and argued that it had benefited the people of Alabama. The North Alabamian had a lot to say about this move, and they said that he should be drummed out of Congress. Next, we had the Centennial Celebrationist Bill. Sloss voted for the appropriation of $3 million for the Centennial Celebration Bill that critics claimed was a wasteful expenditure of money that would only benefit the radical city of Philadelphia and not his constituents. They argued that there wasn't a single penny going to be seen in the state of Alabama, so why was Sloss frittering away their tax dollars? Then there were questions of party loyalty. Sloss was accused of colluding with carpetbagger and Republican George Spencer, voting against the Democratic Party and not having the interests of his constituents in mind when he voted. And his loyalty was also questioned after at least one Republican paper released an editorial praising his work in Congress after they had previously been very, very critical of him. He further broke with his party by voting in favor of the admission of Colorado and New Mexico into the Union, which gave Republicans more votes in Congress. Then there was the pardon broker accusation. Records show that Sloss introduced legislation to pardon a number of former Confederate officers while in Congress. This removed their so-called political disabilities so they could regain rights such as the ability to hold public office. Some press accounts allege that he had charged a fee to the pardoned men for his assistance. And Sloss was, of course, accused of being a poor representative of the people. Statistics show that he missed roughly 1/3 or 33.2% of the roll call votes during his time in office, which shows he was frequently absent. And then last but not least, he ran as an independent candidate in an attempt to secure a third term in office when he had lost the Democratic nomination. The papers and seemingly the general public were not happy with Sloss's decision to run as an independent candidate once he had lost the Democratic nomination to Goldsmith Whitehouse Hewitt. In an article entitled, "Out of Thine Own Mouth Shalt Thou Be Condemned," from the Birmingham Iron Age, Sloss was quoted in 1869 when he had written scathingly in his newspaper of Judge Watkins' decision to run as an independent. Sloss had said, "If Judge Watkins was the best Democrat in the state, we would oppose his election for the reason that he is running against the regular nominee of the party. And we believe the great interest of our people, the hope of obtaining the control of the county and state offices next year by our people depends upon keeping the party together and electing the regular candidates of the party." The article ended, "Oh, consistency, thou art a jewel, but circumstances alter cases. Now it is Major Sloss that wants to go to Congress." The Moulton Advertiser declared of Sloss, "You are politically dead, and you have dug your own grave. It is deep, and 7,000 Democrats will assist in bidding you from the political world in November." Other papers offered criticism. "Independents are political pirates owing fealty to no government." The Huntsville Weekly Democrat wrote of Sloss that his previous actions had led them to speak of him as a tadpole politician who only needed to shed his tail in order to make him a full-size radical croaker. I found 0 articles where sadness was conveyed when Sloss lost his race as an independent. The Selma Times-Journal stated, "Sloss is an incident in those happy riddances which have retired to solitude and obscurity so many of those unfit and incompetent men who floated into official position on the tide of revolutionary demoralization and are now gone forever from public view." Their coverage ended with this not so subtle but rather glorious rant. "Mr. Sloss can never again rise into sufficient importance to provoke newspaper criticism. He has no capacity. He has no power. He has no office. He has no influence now even for mischief. The place and the people that knew him once will know him no more forever. He is as dead politically as if his corpus rested in the tomb of the Capulets or reposed beneath the pyramids." So we've seen that Sloss was embroiled in controversy regarding his Civil War service and his political career. His life outside of those issues leads us to this next story of the Sloss Long shooting. When Sloss and his wife discovered in 1873 that their daughter Mamie was being courted by George Long, they forbid the courtship and ordered Long to stay away from their house and Mamie. According to the Greenville Advocate, Long denounced Sloss and proceeded to assail Sloss's daughter's character, claiming undue intimacy with her. His intent was to ruin her good name and, as one paper said, render her odious to the community, so that Sloss and his wife would be pleased for a marriage to happen between the two of them. He was wanting to force the issue. So Sloss had been out campaigning, and he comes home and he hears that all of this gossip is taking place. And his daughter explains, like, yes, it's Long. He's the one doing this. And Sloss is angry. Imagine the downtown area of a small city, perhaps such as an area as the county courthouse might stand in the center of the town square. It was such an area filled with storefronts on Main Street in downtown Tuscumbia that Sloss would seek revenge. So he goes to a storefront in downtown Tuscumbia on Main Street. His nephew, with the last name of Warren, had a store there. And so he goes, he gets in the second story window, and he waits for Long to pass by. And he incidentally has a shotgun filled with buckshot with him as he waits. So Long comes by, and he's just left the bar on the corner, and he's just sort of taking a leisurely walk home, and he gets even with Warren's storefront, and Sloss shoots him. So it was a huge commotion. There was blood everywhere on the brick sidewalk and everything, and Sloss turned himself into authorities, and Long was carried away on a shutter by some of his friends and thought to be dead. So we have this article right here that says, a year ago, George F. Long, of good name and family, was forbidden by Congressman J.H. Sloss to visit his house. And it goes back over it, but it says, good name and family. Well, Long's family was supposed to be a good name, but Long himself was considered the village idler. He had not been employed for months at the time that this courtship started taking place, and he had been known to get in a number of very questionable positions. For instance, he had become hung on a train hitch as he was going from one car to the other, and had been drugged for almost 3/4 of a mile before he was noticed and released. He seemingly should have died from that, but he didn't. And then his, great character, he's hanging around in bars with just the most random people. And there was this guy named Hans Marjoram who got very annoyed that Long didn't want to have a drink with him. And so they ended up in a knife fight. And Marjoram slits Long's throat, and slits down his face. And from blood loss, he was thought to be dying after that incident, but he didn't. So if that tells you anything about how he reacted to having 4 buckshot in his skull, 1 in his neck, and 2 in his body, then it kind of gives you a little idea of what's to come. There was one paper that said that he was such, his ability to bounce back from situations was such that it would have helped forlorn men's hopes in battle. So, and incidentally, Hans Marjoram, the one that slit his throat, he ends up being found dead in a Memphis alley because he was killed by a rock blow to the skull years later. So definitely a rough crowd that Long ran with, and valid reasons for them to be concerned that maybe he wasn't really the best match for Mamie. So Sloss shoots him, ends up and turns himself in. One article stated, he who wrongs a woman's fame deserves death, and that's the proper verdict of juries and of mankind. And another article said the entire community justified the action of Mr. Sloss. And one simply said it served him right. The papers also claim that Sloss could have avoided all possible charges for his actions if he had challenged Long to a duel instead of ambushing him from a second-story window. In Sloss's defense, it was reported that Long's friends had made many public threats, essentially saying they would attack Sloss or anyone else who dared to attack Long. And as I just said, Long was expected to die of his wounds, but he didn't. Mamie was essentially on house arrest once Long was well enough to move around town again. Accounts differ as to whether Mamie asked to go downstairs for water or medicine, but her request was granted, and I love this quote. Once there, she went and went on and never stopped wenting until she had her beloved traducer alone by her side before a magistrate. This appeared in a November newspaper, but the marriage took place in September. Here's a copy of the marriage record for Mamie and George Long. It shows that they were married on September 23rd, 1874 in Colbert County. So the marriage really took place. The wedding ceremony had barely ended when, of course, there's got to be some more drama to this story. Mamie's mother, Mary Louise Luss Sloss, according to one news account, arrived on the scene with a pair of 6-shooters in her clutches. She made desperate efforts to render her daughter a widow and her hopeful son-in-law an angel. And they continued on and said, the good old lady leveled her artillery and demanded her daughter or gore. Accounts state that it was with some difficulty that Mrs. Sloss was persuaded to leave without her daughter and without any bloodshed. One article did say that she proceeded to relieve her mind before she left. So I think she kind of gave him an earful about it. But they parted ways, and Sloss's daughter and Long went to Long's father's house, and that is where they would live. Because, of course, he was unemployed, so he didn't have a house of his own. A number of newspapers across the nation ran accounts of the wedding and the attempts to stop the pair from marrying. One recapped Long's shooting and recovery, Mamie's escape, and the pair's subsequent marriage. The account ended, nice place, that Tuscumbia, for a quiet courtship. Another account summed up the incident with, Congressman Sloss feels that he made a useless expenditure of 13 excellent buckshot and blasting powder to match. Documents held at the National Archives provide some interesting info into Sloss's time as U.S. Marshal. So Sloss was appointed a U.S. Marshal after the incident we just read about. And incidentally, he was acquitted, in case anybody wonders. He was acquitted and he was never charged for shooting Long. So I guess the U.S. Marshal Service didn't think that it was that big of a deal that he had lay in ambush and shot somebody years before, because he gets this nomination and is appointed. To the right is a brief news article announcing that Sloss had been nominated for U.S. Marshal of the Northern District of Alabama. I tried to find someone who was happy about this nomination, but this lackluster response we see here was the most positive report that I could find. If papers mentioned his taking office, they spoke of it with negativity and dread. They'd already seen his work as congressman, and they just really weren't impressed. So this article says, Honorable Joseph H. Sloss is in nomination for U.S. Marshal for this district. The administration might do much worse than to appoint Mr. Sloss. Really, we would be rather pleased than otherwise at the appointment. However, there are other good men, any one of whom would be a credit to the government and compared with what we have had here in time. So basically they're saying, like, yeah, well, he'll do. He'll do. Maybe. Sloss would end up resigning office under a cloud of accusations regarding embezzlement and mismanagement of the office. In a seeming attempt to cover up the inaccurate charges uncovered by a government audit, Sloss removed 3 deputies, one of which was Thomas G. Hewlett. In response, Hewlett brought a number of charges against Sloss. He claimed Sloss owed him several $1,000s for services rendered as deputy and wrote several letters to the Department of Justice outlining Sloss's many failings while in office. And while some of these failings may have been somewhat fabricated due to Thomas Hewlett's ire over not having $5,000 in his pocket that he was owed, there is truth to some of these accusations, because one of the things that he said was gross dereliction of duty, as such to impede the ability of the office to operate. And the number of times that Sloss wrote to the Department of Justice asking for a leave of absence was impressive. There were a number of, and I'm still trying to confirm all of them because I just found that information recently, but he had at least 8 or 9 for sure leaves of absence where he was just like, oh, I want to go to a conference in Canada. I'll be gone for 2 months. So he definitely was not the most dedicated at this, just as he was not the most dedicated representative. So J.M. Hines was nominated to fill the position of Marshal in August, with Sloss having been indicted on charges of misconduct in May. By October, Sloss was acquitted. Hewlett's case against Sloss would make it to the state Supreme Court, where Sloss would be ordered to pay Hewlett over $5,000 in money owed. So here are a few things that I found in my research that really just didn't fit the rest of the story that I just told you. In 1885, he was a speaker at a YMCA meeting and offered prayers. In 1890, he was an alternate delegate to the International Sunday School Convention in Atlanta. In 1901, he was a deacon of the First Presbyterian Church in Huntsville. And in that same year, he attended the annual meeting of the Madison County Sunday School Association and was appointed to the executive committee. We will hope that he didn't embezzle any funds from them. Amazingly, for the life that he led, and having been a marshal and having made all of these enemies during the course of his life, he died from natural causes in Memphis on January 27th, 1911, at the age of 84. He is buried in Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville, and perhaps slightly ironically, his headstone includes the symbol of the Oddfellows Society, which stands for friendship, love, and truth. So that's the end of the slides. I'm not sure how we are on time. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, we do have time for questions. And if you are online and you have a question, put it in the comments. It'll come to my phone and I can ask it on your behalf. We have one right here.
So many of those magazine articles, newspaper articles were from all over the country. So all of that business made it to Los Angeles and one in Vermont. Everybody knew what was going on.
Yes, and the story of him shooting Long actually made it into the London Times. So I don't know just how far this managed to get as far as getting into European papers, because there's a limit to what I have access to as far as that goes. But the story made it all over the United States. And it was basically like an Associated Press story in a way, where it just got spread far and wide. And that's how newspapers in Vermont and California and Louisiana, like, there wasn't hardly a state that I didn't find something in. It was really fascinating going through these newspaper articles too. Just so much great information to mine from them.
Well, I was curious how you got started. What made you interested in him in the first place?
So I can thank the Encyclopedia of Alabama for that, because I've written some articles for them, and they had a commissioning list of U.S. representatives from the state of Alabama that they needed articles for. And so I just randomly picked a few names off the list, and Sloss was one of them. And in the course of doing the research, I just kept finding story after story after story of things that he had gotten into. And it just became a very, very big project, research project for me that just has been very enjoyable.
But is there some relationship of this Mr. Sloss and Sloss found?
Yes.
Is there a connection between this Sloss and the Sloss furnace in Bourbon?
Yes. So Sloss, Major Joseph Humphrey Sloss was the first cousin of James Withers Sloss. They didn't cross paths very much, I don't think. Sloss did, speaking of things that weren't particularly controversial that he did introduce some legislation that was in support of granting lands to railroads, and that was something that James Withers Sloss had an interest in, because he needed to move the materials that he needed in and out for his work. So there was some connection there, but going back to Hewlett, who was the one who did that lovely little Supreme Court case where he was saying, hey, hand me my back pay. You can assume after somebody hauling you to the Supreme Court that they would not be on the best terms with each other. But I found in the newspaper that James Withers Sloss, when he passed away, that Hewlett was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. So I don't think that there was a great deal of connection between them in their daily life, but they were first cousins.
2 questions. How did he get acquitted of the shooting, and whatever happened to his daughter and her marriage?
So the acquittal question, I guess your guess is good as mine, because times were different and things were acceptable then that aren't today. So I don't know if some money exchanged hands, if they just thought, oh, maybe he'll do me a favor someday and they let him loose, or if the newspapers were correct in saying that public sentiment was essentially, hey, it served long rot. If that's the case, then it was just kind of, they were putting more blame on Long than they did on Sloss. And therefore they were just like, yeah, just don't do it again. I think it was kind of the latter. I think it was kind of that just generally thought that, Sloss should have avenged his daughter. As far as what happened to the daughter, Mamie and George Long get married, and she lives for 9 months and 11 days after the marriage. My first thought when I saw that, when I found an obituary that scene, was like, oh gosh, he killed her. Which was a assumption on my part. And so I kept digging, and I found something that said that she had died from consumption. So she actually died of an illness, and their marriage was very short. He never remarried again.
Please join me in thanking Kayla one more time.
Thank y'all.
And thank everyone for joining us. Remember, next month, May 15th, come hear Bergen Matthews talk about Birmingham jazz. And thanks, y'all.